The night cracked open with flashing red and blue lights, a sharp glare against the soft glow of a street lamp. On the cracked pavement of a quiet suburban street, a man stood pressed against the hood of his own car, his arms twisted behind him by two officers who shouted the words that have become a national scar. "Stop resisting!" But the man wasn't resisting. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent, as though he knew that the slightest twitch, the smallest protest, could ignite something irreversible. The cold metal of the hood burned against his cheek. His heart thudded heavy, not from guilt, but from the weight of a familiar humiliation. The officers didn't know who he was. They didn't know the man beneath their hands had spent 30 years in uniform. They didn't know that the calm in his eyes came not from fear, but from a discipline forged through decades of service. They didn't know he was their superior, the very chief of police who had sworn to protect both them and the community they patrolled. And soon they would learn. The protagonist's quiet power, his name was Charles Whitaker. To the community, he was Chief Whitaker, the first black police chief this city had ever known. But tonight, in plain clothes, driving home after a late community meeting, he was just another black man pulled over for reasons that would later be described vaguely as suspicious behavior. Charles was tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray threading through his close-cropped hair. His presence was naturally commanding, but now, flattened against his own car, he seemed stripped of rank, stripped of recognition, reduced to something faceless. The officers barked commands as though he were a stranger trespassing in his own life, and yet he said nothing. That silence was not weakness, it was strategy. A life carved by service. Chief Whitaker's life had been one long march through discipline, service, and sacrifice. He had grown up in a neighborhood where sirens were more common than lullabies, where police lights were not symbols of safety but of fear. As a boy, he had promised himself that he would become the kind of officer his neighbors never saw, the kind who protected, not persecuted. Years later, he wore the badge, but wearing it had cost him more than most would ever know. He carried scars invisible to the eye, the memory of a fallen partner whose blood stained his uniform, the bitter nights of missed birthdays with his children, the lonely drive home after testifying in cases where his honesty had cost him friends. He had faced bigotry within his own ranks, subtle comments about diversity hires that were meant to sting but only strengthened his resolve. Through it all, Charles had risen step by step to the very top, chief, protector of the city, a man who believed that silence often spoke louder than rage. The conflict grows, hands behind your back. One officer barked again, though Charles's hands were already bound by their grip. The man's voice shook with unnecessary aggression, the kind born of insecurity, of needing control at any cost. A small group of bystanders had gathered on the sidewalk. Their phones glowed like fireflies in the dark, recording, witnessing, but not intervening. Some looked fearful, others weary, as though they had seen this scene before, too many times. Charles could feel their eyes on him. He knew what they saw. Another black man subdued by police. They didn't know he had worn the badge longer than these two officers had been alive. They didn't know he had given his life to building trust between the community and the force. And yet, here he was, his honor crushed into asphalt, his years of service invisible beneath skin color. Still, he remained silent. Escalation stopped resisting. The second officer shouted again, this time pressing harder, forcing Charles's arm into an unnatural angle. Pain flared through his shoulder, sharp and electric. His jaw clenched, but he did not cry out. This was not the first time he had endured pain for the sake of peace. Do you understand the position you're putting yourself in? One officer sneered. Charles breathed slowly, evenly, his voice still locked away, because he knew something the officers did not. Sometimes silence is the most devastating form of resistance. Foreshadowing the shift from the corner of his eye, Charles noticed a flicker of movement. Another patrol car rolling up, its headlights cutting through the night. Inside was Sergeant Elena Cruz, one of the most respected officers in the department, someone who had served under him for years. Her car door slammed, footsteps quickened. The moment was about to turn. The reveal, Chief? Elena's voice sliced through the tension, incredulous, sharp with recognition. The officers froze. Chief, the word hung in the air like thunder. The bystanders stirred, whispering. Phones tilted higher. The officers' hands loosened almost instantly, their bravado draining out like air from a punctured tire. One stammered, Chief Whitaker? Sir, we didn't. But Charles still said nothing. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with deliberate calm, his eyes locking onto theirs. His silence was heavier than any reprimand, sharper than any shouted order. His gaze alone seemed to strip them bare, exposing not just their actions but the ugliness beneath them. The crowd knew now. These weren't just two officers manhandling a black man. They were officers manhandling their own chief. Iconic quotes. Finally, Charles spoke. His voice was steady, deep, carrying the weight of years of service and the sting of tonight's insult. You see a black man before you see a brother in blue. That is why the people don't trust us. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Silence fell heavy around him, broken only by the quiet shuffling of shame from the two officers. Then, after a pause, he added another line that would later echo across social media, shared in countless captions and headlines. Respect is not given to the bad. Respect is given to the man who honors it. The power shift. The bystanders, silent until now, began nodding, some whispering words of support. The glow of phone screens caught tears in the corners of eyes. A woman clasped her hand over her mouth. A man muttered, "That's the chief." God help those officers. The two policemen, pale and shaken, could not meet Charles's eyes. The world had flipped on them in seconds. The power they thought they held had dissolved, leaving only humiliation and the heavy weight of accountability. Elena stood at Charles's side now, her posture protective, loyal. The other arriving officers straightened, realizing what had unfolded, their respect for their chief radiating in the silence. For once, Charles did not carry this moment alone. Climax in visual justice. Charles turned not to his officers but to the crowd, his shoulders squared, his voice steady. This, what you just witnessed, is why we must do better, for you, for every man, woman, and child who looks at us with fear instead of trust. We cannot serve a community we refuse to see. It wasn't a speech rehearsed for cameras. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, spoken directly to the people he had promised to protect. And in that moment the crowd, once silent witnesses, rose in quiet solidarity. A man lowered his phone and began to clap. Another followed. Soon the street was filled with the sound of hands meeting hands, a soft thunder of respect that drowned out the shame of the officers. The two who had held him moments ago stood frozen, their faces pale, their bodies rigid, caught in the unforgiving light of truth. Resolution. Chief Whitaker did not demand their badges on the spot. He did not shout or grandstand. Instead, he walked toward his car, every step deliberate, dignified. His silence had already delivered justice louder than anger ever could. As he opened his car door, he looked back once more. His eyes swept over the officers, then the crowd. "Dignity," he said softly, a final word that lingered in the night. "That's what holds this city together." And with that, he drove away, leaving behind a silence that weighed heavier than chains. A silence that would echo long after his taillights disappeared. Outro and reflection. The story of that night spread far beyond the cracked pavement where it happened. It wasn't just another tale of injustice. It was a mirror held up to a system, reflecting both its flaws and its potential for change. Chief Charles Whitaker's silence had become his power, his calm the sharpest weapon against disrespect. His story reminded people everywhere that true strength does not always roar. It sometimes stands in silence until the world has no choice but to listen. And so the question remains, how many silent battles are fought every day? How many heroes walk among us, unseen, disrespected, yet unshaken? Wherever you are watching from, let this story remind you, respect is not about rank, uniform, or title. It is about dignity, about seeing the human being before the stereotype. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that honor silent heroes who stand tall even when the world tries to push them down.